Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I think that we're live now. So I'm gonna double check, make sure it's showing the stream. Yeah, it should
Yep.
be. Okay.
I see people
All
on the
right.
screen.
We'll get started then. All right. Well, hi everyone. Thank you so much for attending the Suicidal Thoughts Workbook virtual launch. I am Katie Gordon. I'm a psychologist and I'm the author of the Suicidal Thoughts Workbook. The official release date is tomorrow, but some people have gotten it early. Thank you to everyone who has supported that. I'm here with David Klonsky, and Elise Roriani is running late but is hoping to join us later. And we're just going to talk about suicide prevention and some of the ways that David and Elise's work has influenced the book. So, David, would you mind introducing yourself just to start off?
Of course. Hello, everybody. Good evening. My name is David Klonsky. I'm a psychology professor at University of British Columbia. Been studying suicide and self-injury for, I guess, approximately 20 years now, and very excited that some of the ideas that my lab has put out in the past several years were helpful and useful for Dr. Gordon's book.
Absolutely. And sorry if people are hearing an echo. I did a sound test with my friend Joel earlier. Thanks, Joel. But I learned there was an echo, so I'll try to remember to mute when David's talking. Yeah, so the Suicidal Thoughts Workbook, just a little bit of a background about kind of what led me to write it. When I was 18 years old and in college, I was struggling a bit, and my father is a therapist, and he gave me Feeling Good, the New Mood Therapy by David Burns, which is a cognitive behavioral therapy self help book. And I found a lot of the strategies in it to be really useful. It really helped with identifying thought and behavior patterns. And I thought it was great that it was accessible in book form because not everyone can access therapy. And in the case of suicidal thoughts, there are a lot of therapists who might not specialize or have in depth training with helping people who struggle with suicidal thoughts. And so I'm really hoping with the book that that helps to show the kind of tools and research that we do have on suicide prevention and connect with more people. So when I started the book, I wanted to find a framework to use that pulled in the science. My background is as a researcher, even though I'm a clinician too. Um, and I wanted to choose a theory that had scientific support, but that also had very clear practical applications that people could use in their lives. And so I chose to use the three-step theory. And I have never done live stream before, so I'm sure there's a better way to show the graphic, but I actually am just, oh, this is how I'll show it. Um, and the three-step theory, what I really like about it is it identifies specific areas where you can try to help people reduce their risk for suicide and help them when they're suffering. And David was one of the developers of the three-step theory. And so, David, do you mind describing the theory and how you came up with it?
I would be happy to. Those are also two separate questions, what the theory is and how I came up with it. So I don't know if you have a preference of, of what you want me to address.
Do you mind starting with when I get excited, I throw all the questions at you once. Would you mind starting with what the theory is? Because that might maybe give a little bit of an introduction of it and then talk about how you came up
I
with
will
it.
do my best. I always find that a very overwhelming question in like a podcast or webcast kind of format, because it takes at least a full manuscript to sort of explain what the pieces mean and things along those lines. And so there's just even though it's already, as far as theories go, a fairly concise theory, um, there's just no way to describe it in a way that makes sense in 30 seconds. But that said, essentially uh, it begins by addressing the question, why do people feel suicidal? Why does that even develop to begin with? And that is a very important question because we people are very clearly wired biologically, arguably evolutionarily, to avoid pain, avoid injury, and avoid death. So, how is it that a non trivial subset of the population at times considers suicide, attempts suicide, and dies by suicide? So the theory begins by saying, well, it begins with pain. Now, why do we say pain, and what do we mean by that? Um, Fundamentally, we're creatures of behavioral conditioning. We do things that are rewarded. We avoid things that are punished. This is evident even at very, very early ages. If a young child, burns their hand on a hot stove, they learn quickly to, pull that hand away and avoid that stove. Um, and so that is also a fundamental instinct in us, that if something is painful, we have this deep, powerful instinct to avoid it. And so if someone's experience of being alive is painful, aversive, and miserable, that same basic instinct kicks in, that I don't want this anymore. Um, Now, we also have thoughts. We're not only creatures of behavioral conditioning. And so if we have some sense of how to sort of reduce the pain, get to a better future, that's where our focus is. But if we can't, then we feel hopeless. That combination, life is painful, aversive, and miserable, and there's no way for me to stop it. Now we're at a point where the push of I don't want this anymore is towards not being alive, because when you're hopeless, you don't know where else to go. So that's step one of the theory, says the combination of pain and hopelessness is what causes suicidal desire. Step two focuses on connectedness. And the idea is that if the pain is the push away from our current life, connectedness is the pull towards life. And connectedness can be to people that we value and love, but it can also be to other kinds of sources of purpose or meaning, causes we care about, roles, jobs, and so forth. And so the second step says that suicidal desire becomes particularly strong, becomes particularly intense, because most often suicidal desire is experienced at modest levels when it is experienced. It becomes particularly intense if the pain is greater than or overwhelming our sense of connectedness to things, either because maybe we're not connected to a lot, or even if we are connected to a lot, when pain is intense, it removes our ability to engage with connections we otherwise value. And then step three addresses the conditions under which strong suicidal desire progresses to potentially or transitions to a potentially lethal attempt. It's a key part because most people who feel suicidal do not attempt. And even among people who've made suicide attempts, most people, when they feel most instances of suicidal ideation do not lead to attempts. So, under what conditions does that happen? And the theory suggests that there are various contributors, dispositional, acquired, practical contributors. The capability for suicide, a construct introduced by Thomas Joyner, that we've somewhat elaborated upon in the theory. So that's the briefest version of the theory I can give, and I apologize that it wasn't all that brief.
No, that's an excellent overview, and it is for something as complicated as suicide and suicidal thoughts are. I really appreciate the way that that's described. I think it makes a lot of intuitive sense to people. And so in my book, kind of focusing on some of those different things that David highlighted, what I really tried to do is, you mentioned pain in the first step. And so the book tries to use cognitive behavioral therapy, which I'll use. Elise Roriani made this really cool illustration for the book. It shows that cognitive behavioral therapy, one way to look at it is that thoughts, emotions, and behaviors are all connected, and the way that we interpret things and affects how we feel and how we behave. And so the pain reduction part in the book really focuses on identifying thoughts. And one of the things that comes up a lot in therapy practice with people who are struggling with suicidality is they're really hard on themselves. They're really critical of themselves, and they have a hard time, even when people say positive things to them, they have a hard time believing it. And so there's a lot of focus on learning tools for pushing back and influencing some of those thoughts and behaviors. Problem solving is another way to reduce pain. And from what I've and people that I've worked with in therapy, sometimes when you're struggling with suicidal thoughts and you're in a really painful place, it's hard to see other options for coping with situations. And so those are two main themes. The other thing you mentioned was hopelessness. And that's definitely a theme of the book. By the way, I wanted to say thank you to everyone commenting in the stream, the YouTube comments. I can see all of them, and they're really, really helpful to see and very encouraging, and it's very moving to me. So thank you so much. The hope aspect of it. Hope is my middle name, which a few people have asked about. The backstory on that is that my grandfather, actually both of my grandfathers' names begin with H, and so my parents wanted to give me a middle name that began with H. They considered Hermione pre-Harry Potter days, but they went with Hope. But aside from that, that's not why I selected this acronym, I promise. So the other part of the book, it really focuses on how to build hope and find hope. And so it focuses on seeking help, finding optimism, changing perspective, and attending to emotions, really identifying what those painful emotions are and what you need. And so those are some of the ways that I tried to look at that. And I also looked at connections, way to strengthen relationships, and meaning. I have several visual prompts to remind me of things I want to say. I actually read Man's Search for Meaning, which I had read a long time ago. Have you read this, David?
A while ago, so I'm very aware of it, and it's one of those books that I have readily available because I want to read it again, and it's sort of like having 20 articles open on your browser that you're going to read any moment, but do not.
Yeah, I've got a large stack of books I'm intending to read, but that book I happened to read twice during the pandemic, and there are a lot of very useful strategies in there for increasing connections, and so that's how I found the theory to be so helpful in an applied way. How did you come up with the theory?
I came up with the theory completely accidentally. I For the first decade more of my career, I was very happily doing descriptive exploratory research. It just felt to me like that was the state of knowledge in suicide, that we just had a lot to learn before we started connecting the dots. But I guess when you're spending a lot of time in the field, your mind is doing things. Sometimes you're not aware of it. And what specifically happened is that a sort of a distant relative who I'd known for a long time, something happened in that person's life that made me afraid of their suicide risk. It was someone who had been struggling in various ways for a long time. So I actually was confused about my own reaction. I was thinking, why am I afraid now? What's different now? Because there's been a lot of struggles. And as I started to articulate just to myself, like, why am I worried now and I wasn't before? I suddenly realized that I had a narrative about what caused suicide risk. And I ended up just firing off an email to Alexis May, who's been co-author for most of the three-step theory papers, and saying, I think I have a theory of suicide. And I just, I sent her off an email. I was like, what do you think? And we started writing a paper together. What's interesting is that almost the last draft of the paper had two parts. It really just explained feeling suicidal and then transitioning to an attempt. But part one had this long corollary about what happens with connectedness if it's still present. And it was so long, eventually I decided this is a very substantive part. It needs to stand on its own. And so then it ended up having three parts. And frankly, we spent a long time thinking this, I guess we're supposed to name this thing. We have a paper, we're submitting it, we need a name for the theory. And that was not something I was particularly eager to do. Names carry disproportionate weight in terms of people's impressions. I played with a lot of things, and this was just the least bad of all the options. And I still think it's the least bad title of all the options. I've never come up with something that I like better, but I've never particularly liked this name either. Mainly because it leads people to think that the steps are chronological steps, which they're very much not. They're more like steps of logic. What makes people feel suicidal? What are the conditions under which it becomes strong? What are the conditions under which it transitions? But of course, there's all sorts of ways to walk around the world with high capability, and that will just never come into play if you don't, also have suicidal desire. And you can have a few connections but not be in pain, and so on and so forth. So anyway, that's the story of how came up with the theory. And it's more or less stayed the same as the initial conceptualization, maybe some tweaks of understanding here or there.
I think it's interesting how much those real life experiences can generate ideas, and that's one of the strengths of the theory that I like is that it does try to talk about when people are struggling with suicidal thoughts, with which millions of people do every year, and trying to understand what leads people to attempt suicide from that. The book focuses a lot on keeping people safe during crisis, about finding ways, and that can look really different depending on who you are. There are so many different things. A big part of it has been means safety. If you have a gun, this is something I regularly talk to therapy patients about, making sure it's stored safely. I mean, things like that can make a big difference for suicide prevention, making sure that it reduces that capability for suicide by restricting methods. And so I think that's a key part of it too. And I'm wondering, I'm asking this because I've heard you talk about it, but I think it's important and interesting to share. I think for a long time, well, some people believe in suicide prevention. A big part of it is trying to predict who's going to attempt suicide. The three-step theory talks about what conditions are likely to make it for someone to attempt suicide when they have suicidal thoughts. Um, what was the purpose? What do you view as the role of the theory? Is it predicting suicide? Is it preventing suicide? What do you view the role of the theory as?
The role of the theory is to help understand and then help prevent. Um, One of the things where my own thinking has evolved over the last several years is first coming to terms with the fact that there isn't some one-to-one relationship between understanding and prevention because context matters so much. Um, you know, what causes, the pain and hopelessness that is the story of suicide for, an 80-year-old widow is not going to be the same story as for a 13-year-old boy. How you apply this knowledge in an individual outpatient setting versus a school context. How do you enhance connectedness, reduce capability, improve, pain and hopelessness in a school context or a community context? What family level interventions can impact those targets? What about at a population or policy or government level? um, all of these things change how one might intervene, and so that's one piece. Now I do think it's very useful to have actionable targets. To the extent the theory is accurate, what it really does mean is that in any context, if we understand a person or a segment of the population, a community's sources of pain, why are they feeling hopeless about things getting better, what can we do to enhance connectedness, and how can we reduce capability? Those targets, according to the theory, are universally relevant. And so they really can focus suicide prevention efforts in any given context or for any given person. But in the end, it is going to be a melding of sort of universal principles, so to speak, applied ideographically, applied in a personalized manner. Um, this is something that sometimes people have trouble wrapping their minds around, but I think there's all sorts of examples all over science and health and even psychology. I think a great example, which the theory sort of uses as a context for the first part at least, is principles of punishment, reinforcement and punishment, and behavior therapy. Um, no one says, well, all right, reinforcement sounds like a good principle, but it's not really useful unless you give me a list of what's reinforcing. That's actually, of course, not true. Not only can you not come up with a comprehensive list, but what's reinforcing for one person can be punishing for another person. Like exercise, that might be really reinforcing for someone and really aversive to someone else. Or even something like the end of a complicated relationship could be devastating for one person and liberating for another person. And so you can't come up with a finite list of these are the things that are, cause pain or things along those lines. But yet you can, both for behavioral theory and for the three-step theory, if you understand the principles and how they operate, they become extremely actionable in a given context. Now you also raise prediction, and you raise it because there's a whole thing there. I've a half an hour talk I give on that topic. So again, it's one of those things that's hard to boil down. But notice that when we talk about things like behavior therapy and how useful it is, we can understand, fear learning. We can treat phobias really well with those behavioral principles. But if we have a room full of 1,000 people and you tell a behavioral therapist, all right, predict for me which person in the room will develop the next anxiety disorder, we could do that above chance. based on temperament or things like that, but we can't do that with high accuracy. But no one would say the failure to do that, to predict that with high accuracy, indicts the validity of behavioral principles or means that they're not useful. They're incredibly valid and they're incredibly useful. And I think there's something similar in suicide. Even if we knew with 100% certainty what the forces are that raise suicide risk, and let's say for a moment the three-step theory nailed it, even though no idea ever 100% nails anything in science, and that it's pain and hopelessness are where suicidal desire comes from. Um, Knowing someone's pain and hopelessness at a given moment does not at all tell you in a useful way whether they're going to be suicidal in a month. Whether they're suicidal in a month depends on how the level of pain, aversiveness, and misery they're experiencing at that time and the hopelessness they're feeling at that time. So the only way that we would expect pain and hopelessness today to predict what's happening in a month is to the extent to which they predict the pain and hopelessness at that time. And people struggle with that concept in suicide, but it is just the way things operate in other areas of health and science. We're terrible at predicting who's going to have a heart attack or die from a heart attack in the next week or two. No one thinks it's a failure of a doctor or science if that person saw the doctor, had a full checkup. They measured their blood pressure and they took blood and they, measured their heart rate, and then they have a heart attack in 2 weeks. And you're like, how did you not know that? We only expect in broad ways doctors to say, well, you're at roughly elevated risk, but we understand pretty well what causes heart attacks, how those arteries get clogged, the kinds of things that lead to that. Super useful information for crisis intervention. We know to open that clog. Super useful information for more upstream kinds of interventions, whether it's lifestyle change or medications that reduce clogging in the arteries. Um, there's so many other examples, whether it's behavioral principles in psychology, heart disease, and believe me, I got a whole bunch more. Whether it's drunk driving or homicide or stroke, or an analogy I've been using recently, which has to do with a napkin on my desk and where's it going to be in 2 weeks. And no one can tell me, physicists can't tell me the answer to that, even though the forces that will act on that napkin are boring and ordinary, but we don't know what forces are going to act on that. So similarly, someone could be in tremendous pain now, but we don't know if something will alleviate that pain on the scale of minutes or hours. Someone can feel hopeless right now. We don't know if something will alleviate that. And similarly, someone can feel wonderful now, but we don't know what might happen in their lives or what through what they experience. And so, in other words, or in short, pain and hopelessness and the other things that matter, they ebb and flow over time, just like all the other experiences, just like physical forces. And so in suicide, when we say, well, we should measure pain now, and that will tell us where someone's going to be, in a month. It's just like saying, if I have a coffee mug and right now it's moving at this rate, well, all right, measure that force, just assume it will be linear. And then in a month, that coffee cup will be, some number of miles in that direction. It's silly. It's ridiculous. It doesn't fit nature. Yet no one will argue that laws of motion are invalid. They're incredibly valid. They're incredibly useful. You just can't use them to predict the future if you don't continually measure them. How about we leave it there for now?
I'm glad you brought up the napkin. I was honestly hoping you were bring up the napkin because I do think it's a very clear example. And I think that sometimes in our field, if we focus so much on prediction that we're not trying to help people who are suffering, struggling, and in pain, then it's a huge obstacle. And so I think there are things that we know increase risk for suicide and cause people emotional pain, and it's time to help them with those conditions, whether or not we can predict with some kind of precision. And that doesn't disprove a model, like you said, if we can't pinpoint exactly what's going to happen with one person. So one thing, I'm going to talk a little bit about Elise's art again, because I think one of the aspects of the three-step theory that I think resonates with people who I've talked to in my personal life and also as a therapist is the highlighting the pain and the hopelessness. I think that the connections, people get that too, but the pain and hopelessness really, I think, capture suicidal suffering. And I think that people, as you were saying, people can take all different types of pathways to get to that same point. and yet it's worth identifying some commonalities. So when I was writing the book, most of it was written during the pandemic and pre-vaccine. So I was mostly writing it in my in a room in my house. I actually write a lot in my bed, which psychologists tell you not to do. Oh, Elise is there. Perfect timing. Hi. I'm going to add her to the stream. Hi, Elise.
Hello.
Came right on time. I was just going to talk about your art.
Oh, perfect.
Elise, do you mind introducing yourself quickly to the people who are watching?
Yeah, totally. So yeah, my name is Elise. I use she, her pronouns. I am an art therapist and counselor in Chicago. And I also am an illustrator and designer. And I'm also a person with lived experience, and I am an attempt survivor. So I come to this work in a lot of different ways.
Thank you so much for joining. So I was saying during the pandemic, I was working a lot in my house since the coffee shops and things weren't open, and I had 2 prints by you up because it was important to me when I was thinking through the book to acknowledge 2 things. So these are the 2 prints. I'll talk about them. One is that I think cognitive behavioral therapy is a very useful coping tool, and I think there are a lot of therapeutic tools that are helpful and can help people when something comes up. They have something they can go to that can help them to feel empowered and like they can relate to themselves in different ways. I've certainly found that to be true in therapy and in my own life. And so this is one of the prints, and as you can see, it kind of captures cognitive behavioral therapy. And the idea is it really looks at when people are struggling with suicidality or other types of suffering, the negative thoughts tend to be really powerful. And so a big one, I think all of these are important questions to ask, but one is, what would I say to a friend? I think there's an enormous amount of self-criticism when people are struggling, and then it can become worse because they blame themselves for not being able to feel better. And so sometimes having these different ways to look at themselves and look at their thoughts can be helpful. So this was one major theme I wanted to pay attention to. But the other thing that I think is really important is to acknowledge that when people are struggling, it doesn't come from just thoughts and interpreting things. There are a lot of things in the world that are painful for people. And it's so important to acknowledge that, because I think otherwise people can feel like, I just need to think about it differently. And I hear that a lot in therapy, where people say their loved ones say, oh, my partner or my friend just says, I just need to think positive. And then they end up just not talking anymore about it. And so I really like this print because it talks about digging deeper to address mental health and breaking through some of those individual pathways into a lot of places where, if we want suicide prevention as a society and we want good mental health, that means reducing trauma, reducing discrimination, making sure that people have their basic needs met of housing, food security, and healthcare, etc. And so those were kind of my guiding principles. And I'd love to ask you, Elise, what kind of inspired you to create these prints?
Yeah, totally. The Dig Deeper is one of my favorite illustrations that I've made, and one that I was kind of surprised by the reaction that I got in the best way. But I think what inspired the Dig Deeper one is kind of a combination of things. I think when I started out in the advocacy world, before I was a therapist and before I'd really started school, it was just more about my story. And I don't think I had the critical lens that I do now. And so it very much was more of that mainstream type of medical model and all of that. And it took me a minute to kind of find my way to I think as my politics shifted, as I learned more, as I got more involved in the lived experience community, and in my educational program, was very rooted in social justice. Obviously, all institutions sometimes not always the greatest, but I think that I actually am really grateful for how my program incorporated that, because I think it really challenged my thinking. And so it really broadened the way that I think about mental health and suicide. And then when I started working with clients, it became even more apparent of like, you're sitting across from someone who is feeling suicidal because they can't afford rent and they can't find a job, and there's, oppression that they're dealing with. And it's like, how am I going to be like, think positive? Like, it's like, there's things that I think we're doing a disservice if we're not looking at these deeper things, because then we're not really, helping. And so I think it's interesting that you have those two illustrations, because I think they are kind of two sides of it, of like, there are these things that, yeah, thinking it, trying to change your thoughts is not gonna help it in that way. But then there are situations where kind of bringing in that CBT and the assumptions we're making or things can help. And so I think it's like not one or the other, but we need to make sure that kind of both of those are coming in. But yeah, I think my inspiration always kind of pulls from those different areas of like my personal experience and other advocates and clinical work, kind of all together.
Thank you. Absolutely. I think it is kind of a dialectic, I guess the DBT fans might say, in that it's true that there are a lot of things that are big picture and we can have some impact on, but also there are some immediate skills that can be somewhat helpful to people too. And it is kind of a balance of making sure to recognize that. One of the illustrations that you created for the book, this hope one, which I showed before, I had sent to you as kind of, I think I made it in PowerPoint as my main thing proficient in, since I don't have Microsoft Paint anymore. And I had candles or something like that, but you made them sparklers, which I really like. And part of the thing that I think working with people who are struggling with suicidal thoughts and having been close to people who are struggling, I think the idea of like you're gonna shift from this space where things are really painful and hard to this positive huge amount of light is intimidating, actually. And the idea is that if you can create a little spark, it doesn't mean that everything is fixed, but it means that some of the pain can be soothed, or maybe it can be a start on a different pathway. So I love the sparklers, and I have had a lot of positive feedback on that. And I was interested in how people respond to your art, because I feel like a big part of, I mentioned this theme when I was talking to Dave about the 3-step theory. Part of what I like is that it is complicated, but people can understand it. It's simple enough to be understandable. I feel like with art, what you do is you take very complicated therapeutic and mental health ideas and create it in a way that people connect to. And I was wondering what that's been like on social media, sharing your art and having people connect with those mental health ideas.
Yeah, I think it's interesting, because I think when I started creating art, it always had been like mental health themed, but I think it wasn't so much like information. Like I would, like letter a positive quote or like, things like that. And I might talk about mental health. But I think as I started, obviously as I started learning more and I was in school, it helped me to make sense of what I was learning. So I have ADHD, and it's really hard for me to like sit with like really heavy academic texts and like long like all of this stuff where I'm like, this is not keeping my attention, even if I'm like interested in the topic. And so I think part of it was that too, of like, I'll be like reading, like say a book about trauma, and it's like explaining, how trauma works in the brain. And I'm immediately like, oh, that would be like, I can make this an illustration, like, because that'll help me to retain that information versus just reading it on a page. And so I think it really appeals to like visual learning. And I think for people who aren't necessarily in the field, it can make it easier to kind of understand it. And then I think people who are in the field, I get a lot of feedback that it's really helpful for them to use with clients, to have, in their office on the wall, like for clients to see, and kind of using it as a tool. And so my art has kind of shifted, I think, into a little more of like educational, informational, which I actually really like, and feels kind of full circle for me, because I remember one of my professors when I was in art school for undergrad said something about like that I really like to take like data and like translate or something. And I think back then I was like, oh, like maybe. And then now as I got more into it, I was like, that makes sense. I do think I kind of pull in this information and then try and like figure out a way to express it. And yeah, so the response has been fantastic. It's been really, every time I'm always like surprised. And I think especially for things like the dig deeper illustration that gets a little more that goes a little deeper than just kind of like the positive quotes. Like I think there's always a worry of like, there's always gonna be people who disagree, there's people who will get mad at me for being political or whatever, but I think I've been really like pleasantly surprised by how many people resonated with it. And so I think it also got my work closer to the people who think like me and who are looking for this type of work too. So yeah, the feedback's been really great, and I love, being able to do this.
Thank you. I kind of want to ask the same question, David. Have you what kind of feedback have you had on the three-step theory from maybe people who have lost someone to suicide or people who have struggled themselves? Do they feel like they relate to it?
I mean, certainly one goal is that the theory should resonate with people with lived experience. I mean, if it didn't, that would be a clue to me that there's some problem there, either in the content or the communication of the content, or both. And so, I mean, when people come up to me and they tell me that it resonates, it feels good from the theory standpoint, but usually it feels terrible from the personal standpoint. One just time that sticks out in my mind, although it's heartbreaking every time I think about it, is I gave a talk at one point where the audience included folks with lived experience and loss survivors, and a mom came up to me and said, "Thank you. I feel like for the first time I understand my child's suicide." Um, and I certainly do take note when people with lived experience tell me in person or over social media that the theory really resonates with them. And I also take note when therapists tell me that they were able to, communicate the theory to their clients. And well, yes, it's when people feel suicidal, usually is because they're feeling a lot of pain. They feel hopeless that things can get better, and what they're connected to in life is not making the pain worth it. And I've even had I don't remember their exact position, but I think it was someone who, worked for law enforcement, and who's the kind of person who, if someone's threatening to jump off a bridge, for example, is sort of, is sent there, and said that they found it useful to sort of just use that as the conversation. Like, I get it. You're in tremendous pain. You feel like there's no hope for getting out of this. Can we chat? Can I talk with you? And has reported that that has helped them connect with people in that kind of situation. So I certainly do pay attention to that. I also want to be a scientist about it and note that if it's not resonating with people, those people aren't going to exactly rush to tell me that. So I want to acknowledge that reality too. And just because I'm grateful when people tell me that, I take it as a very important source of evidence that it's on the the theory's on the right track. At the same time, I don't want to be too quick to just assume that, like, that the plural of anecdote is data. And I mean, and if there's people out there who it does not resonate with, I want to pay equal attention to that. I do want to say that the dig deeper part really resonates with me as well. And it's one of my favorite parts of the theory, because it does not at all assume that the pain and hopelessness is due to mental illness, or that the pain and hopelessness is due to someone who's just not thinking about the world in the ideal way. It very much assumes that there are very real sources of pain, that there's very real sources of hopelessness that need changes. So if someone's financially been devastated and feel like that, they can't support themselves, or maybe they can't support their family, and they don't know what to do, they're going to be homeless. That's incredibly painful. There's a lot of reasons to feel hopeless there. I mean, there's also could be some reasons to feel hopeful if we can sort of help them, find a strategy for a way forward. But that's, to me, that person's not feeling suicidal because they have a mental illness. That person's feeling suicidal because their circumstances are bringing about tremendous pain and hopelessness. And sure, I mean, probably there's always ways we can think about things differently or better, and that can be helpful. But I wouldn't want to assume that fundamentally the problem is in that person's head. Fundamentally, it's that person's circumstance. And to to bring up another example, as far as I could tell, the sort of the subgroup or the subdemographic where suicide rates are highest are transgendered individuals. And from my perspective, that makes perfect sense from the theory, because you know people who are transgendered are um, it's tremendously painful to be part of a society that's largely rejecting and not understanding. It certainly is going to mess with one sense of hope that there's a bright future ahead. It causes all sorts of problems with connectedness, sometimes with family, but also just in the other kinds of connections we value day to day, that prospective employers will respect us and fully embrace us, that prospective educators, that the people we meet at the grocery store, your ability to just feel connected to society and the world, given the way society is constructed right now. It doesn't have to be that way, and hopefully it'll get better. Um, and so, that's another example where it would not feel right to me to see that elevated suicide rates in that population as like, oh, it's due to mental illness. If we could treat the mental illness, that feels off to me. Now, that said, mental illness can be a very powerful source of pain and hopelessness. So I don't want to minimize that either. I think mental disorders are frequently a very important cause of pain and hopelessness and suicide risk. It's just that they're certainly not the only kinds. And the dig deeper part, it's so important to understand that there's so many different real sources of pain and hopelessness that are not just mental illness. While at the same time recognizing that mental illness can and will play a role for a lot of people. And if I can just conclude on a larger point, you asked the question and at the beginning of this, Katie, what sort of how do I see what role do I see the theory playing in prevention? And I started off by saying, well, how one implements the theory. The theory gives very specific treatment targets. If you want to understand someone's suicide risk or reduce it, then you need to understand and target their pain, hopelessness, connectedness, and capability for suicide. But across different people, different contexts, how you do that, or the storage of the pain and hopelessness, and how you address those things will be very different. And so, what that really does require is people who can understand the theory and apply it. And so, all of that was a long-winded way of saying my real answer is that people like you will get the theory and then use your expertise, which involves a lot of expertise I do not have, to apply it in meaningful ways, such as writing this workbook. And I loved hearing so much that the story from Elise just now, who I was gonna say I don't know well. I mean, I don't really know at all other than the social media. To hear that, it's not just, I have no artistic ability or visual, and I'm not a visual learner, so it's very foreign to me. So I just sort of imagine like, well, Katie says the concept and you somehow draw a picture. And I don't understand how any of that works. But to hear that that's the natural way that you think, and that it's in some ways an instinct for you, like a natural talent for you, not just that you can draw, but to translate complicated concepts into um, these artistic outputs that resonate with people. It's in a very selfish way. It's like a dream come true for me, and I'm just so grateful for what you two produced. It's like as good as I could have imagined.
Thank you. Thank you so much. That really means a lot to me. I think I was anxious when anyone first read the book, but I think when David wrote me a very supportive email, and when Elise told me she liked my idea behind the illustrations, that meant a lot to me, because for a long time it was just writing in my room, like I mentioned, and not sharing it with people. And so I was anxious to hear. So it means a lot. I really think that both of your work allowed me to make it so that it's not, the whole book is not CBT chapter after, it's not all cognitive behavioral therapy. In fact, it's kind of a framework, because I do think that's part of the picture, but a lot of it is about how can we find connections when we're struggling? How can we think flexibly about finding resources that are available, and also how can we treat ourselves in the face of real pain, and soothe some of those emotions. And so my hope is that having those tools empowers people with a variety of different circumstances, at a minimum, to feel understood and validated. That I don't think that there are, I think that there are some self-help books that are kind of like, get up, say this affirmation to yourself, and like go out there and do the thing, and you're all better, or with these 5 easy tricks. I don't think it's like that. I really don't. But I do think there are there are skills available from psychotherapy. There are resources, and there are reasons to be hopeful. The theme of the Dig Deeper poster, I mean, something that's brought a lot of meaning to people is working to push against those things, joining with organizations, with like-minded people, carving out something. And I mentioned Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning. I mean, I think that connecting with people who view things similarly and pushing against that can be really helpful. And so I'm really pleased that I was able to be influenced by both of your work. And I think anything else that we should talk about? I notice we're kind of getting to 10 minutes before I ask you to share your social medias. Actually, there is one more thing I did want to ask. Elise, I was going to ask you what you think art adds to therapy, which I know is probably rough for a short answer, but I think about what it would be like to have that skill. So what does art mean when you're working with someone one-on-one?
Yeah, there's a lot. There's so many things that it does, but I think I often explain it to clients on like a spectrum of like how we can use it. And so kind of on one end, it might be very open-ended. Like I'll have clients who know exactly what they want to make. We come in, they make art together. We might talk about it. We might not talk a ton about it because that's not really the part that feels most necessary for them. It's more of like that process. And then some people want more of like a directive of like, here is what, we can work on, and it relates to, whatever goals. And then there's space in between. But I think what's really helpful about it that I see for other people, and that what was helpful for me when I did art therapy as a patient, is that, obviously there's a lot of things that can be really hard to talk about for whatever reason. And so having another way to be able to explore that can be really beneficial for people, so that they don't always have to verbally talk about it. And sometimes through making that art and having that space to process, we then become able to talk about it, because now there's this thing that we can talk about the art. And so it feels a little separate from us, because that's sort of this like object in between. And just, it can really help with creative expression and the process itself. I think I often think about it and how it helps us practice skills too, like frustration tolerance. Like, what about when your art is not going the way you want and you want to just like rip it up or something, or like building mastery, like getting better at like doing something. Like I have clients who will want to just like learn how to draw, and that is like, okay, yeah, it might be helpful for your self-esteem to like really do this like skill-based, way. So I think there's a lot of ways it can be incorporated, but I find that creativity can be really beneficial to also change some things up if people have been in talk therapy for a long time, or maybe there's certain things that they feel like they want to explore in a different way.
Thank you. I think some people in my personal life that I'm close to, and some of my patients, have found art therapy really helpful. I have no background in it at all, but talking to them inspired me to actually try to put some more creative project ideas, a meaning collage, hope box, things like that. Because I do think, I think you're right. I mean, I agree with you that those are the things I hear, that allows space to try something new and to build some other skills and different approaches to situations. And I think that's so important. I want to thank you both so much for joining me today. It's just like a dream virtual book launch to have you both here, because your work's meant so much to me. Where can people find you to continue following your work?
You can find my work primarily on Instagram. It's just my full name, Elise Veriani. Same on my Twitter. And I have a website that's also all of it's my name, so it's really easy. Just type it in on the different social media, and then my website is just myname.com, and that's where you can find those prints and other sort of products. And I think my email list is on there. I very rarely send emails, but I'm pretty sure it's on there, which is another way to find out what I'm working on. But
Yeah, I was convinced to join Twitter about 5 years ago, I think, by a student. And there's pros and cons, but I think the pros outweigh the cons, I think. Anyway, I'm on Twitter at Klonsky Lab. If you happen to have a side interest in martial arts, you can also find me at Klonsky MMA, although it's my Klonsky Lab account that is by far the more active one. And I do a lot of email. I'm also very bad at email. So you can email me, but please email a second time if you don't hear from me the first time.
Thank you both, and I'll put links to that. My website is katherinehgordon.com, and you can read more about their work there. I have some links describing both Elise and David. And I guess I just want to thank again everyone for the wonderful supportive comments I'm seeing the stream. I did notice I accidentally put one of them on the frame for like the first 20 minutes, but I seem to have corrected that problem. So thank you all so much. The book is the Suicidal Thoughts Workbook, and available mostly wherever books are sold. I think Amazon Bookshop, and internationally you can buy it from Book Depository, and they have free worldwide shipping rates. I sincerely am grateful for every person who has gotten a copy, and I really hope, my deep hope, my main inspiration for this is to help people who are suffering to feel less alone and to feel that they have some tools and some support as they navigate the very difficult things in their lives. So thank you all so much for tuning in tonight, and I hope you all have a wonderful night.